So last week I failed to record, so if you missed it, you can email me. I'll email you the sheets, but a brief overview. We started looking more closely at this theodicy problem, the problem of evil, which basically can be summed up in people saying, well, if God is all-powerful and all good, why do bad things happen? Why is there so much suffering? And so we started looking at different Christian answers to that problem. We started with a guy named Irenaeus, and as the old example, and the more modern example, a guy named John Hick. Now, John Hick basically gives the answer that evil is necessary for us to be able to progress and become more godlike. The phrase he uses is kind of like soul-making, soul-creating, that our souls need that work, and you have to have the conflict, the evil, to be able to get better and better. Just like you can't really appreciate the warm summer until you've been in the really cold winter. You can't really appreciate sleeping late unless you have to get up early all the time. So in order to kind of be better, get more towards being godlike, evil has this necessary function. You have to know suffering to become more holy. That makes sense in a lot of ways. You have to have sometimes a struggle to move on. You have to have conflict to often get better at things. But the challenge is it gives almost a dignity to evil, an important place. And we talked about last week a little bit, it kind of crashes on the rocks of, well, tell me how it helped the souls of all those who went to concentration camps to go through that. Tell it to the parents who lose a baby in the neonatal ICU that really it's for their own good. It's to help them get closer to God that their child lived for a day. So it doesn't fully make sense to us. Now, if you want to know more about that, I wrote a sermon on Friday for November 2nd, 2022, for All Saints Sunday, kind of answering the question a little bit more of why do these things happen. I talk about John Hick a little more on that. So if you're interested in more, just put it on your calendar now. First Sunday of November, we'll talk more about it. Today we're going to talk about Augustine or Augustine. It's kind of like tomato or tomato. Either way works. I had a professor in seminary who was a big Augustine scholar and always talked about Augustine's harmonica. We had this kind of funny thing we do each year in the seminary. We kind of, like at SNL, we make fun of theology and our professors and all that. So I wrote a special song, kind of like Adam Sandler's Hanukkah, about Monica. And you say Augustine, I say Augustine. It's funnier if you hear the song and you went to the class. So there's a little bio of Augustine. He's like one of those major church theologians that influenced everything. So the very first president of Princeton, B.B. Warfield, said, the Reformation can be summed up as the Augustine's theology of the church versus Augustine's theology of grace. And that was really what each side, the Luther, the Reformers, and the Catholic theologians were all appealing to Augustine. And all kind of saying, we have Augustine on our side. There are people like that today. We all try to go and point, hey, this guy's actually on our side. Everybody wants to claim Lincoln or something like that. So you have to understand a little bit of Augustine's past, just kind of see how he comes to the problem of evil. So the distinctive approach adopted by Augustine had a major impact on the Western theological tradition. By the 4th century, the problems raised by the existence of evil and suffering had become something of a theological embarrassment. Because people were saying, our God is all powerful, our God is all good. And they're like, well, why is this, isn't this happening to you? Yeah. It was becoming kind of an embarrassment to them. So trying to find out what can this answer be? Come on, and we just started. I just gave a recap of last week. So Augustine kind of started his early life being kind of what's called a Manichaean. Now, Manichaeism is a form of Gnosticism. And Gnosticism is basically any kind of religious system in which there's kind of a secret knowledge, that only the people on the inside get to know all the stuff. And so he kind of was fascinated with Manichaeism for a while. So Gnosticism, including its variant form Manichaeism, had no difficulty accounting for why there's evil. In that system, evil comes from matter. That matter, physical stuff, is necessarily bad and evil. So created world, bad. spiritual world good. The whole goal of salvation is to leave the bad physical world and go to the good spiritual world. So salvation is your soul leaving bad body to go to this perfect spiritual world. So salvation is to redeem humanity from the evil material world and transfer it to a spiritual realm which is uncontaminated by matter. Now, why is the physical world bad and evil? Well, a central aspect of many of these systems, including Manichaeism, is the idea of a demiurge. That is, a demigod who is responsible for forging the world in its present form out of pre-existent matter. So matter's there, they create the world. But they're not very good at their job, and so the world stinks. That's it in a nutshell. It's kind of like you were assigned to build a bridge, but you didn't plan it well and didn't use good materials, so it fell down and collapsed. It's the bridge builder's fault, not whoever else's. That's kind of what Manichaeism is getting at. This demigod created the world, but did a poor job, and that's why everything's broken. And so, material world is bad. So, the Redeemer God was thus regarded as being quite distinct from the Creator demigod. So demigod creates, but then there's a Redeemer God that says, man, you did a bad job. I'm going to fix it by taking all their souls out of this bad physical world and taking them to the spiritual realm. So you have two different gods here. So in Manichaeism, with a lot of these other Gnostic systems, you have this dualism. You have a good God and a not so good God, and they battle with each other for who's going to ultimately win the final battle and save souls and all that stuff. So you don't actually see this notion of a devil or an evil one come into any kind of Jewish thought much or Christian thought until kind of this intertestament period between the end of the Old Testament and before the beginning of the New Testament, when the Persians kind of had more contact with the Jews, and they brought with them this kind of Zoroastrianism and Manichaeism that had more this dualistic thought. Now, Augustine didn't like this approach once he kind of finished up with Manichaeism. For him, creation and redemption were the work of the one and same God. It was therefore impossible to ascribe the existence of evil to creation, for this merely just transferred blame to God. For Augustine, God created the world good, meaning it was free from the contamination of evil. But that leaves the question, where does evil come from? And if God created the world good, did this day one, good, very good, break time nap. If all of that's good, where does evil come from? So Augustine's fundamental insight is that evil is a direct consequence of the misuse of human freedom. God created a humanity with the freedom to choose good or evil. Sadly, humanity chose evil. As a result, the world is contaminated by evil. What basically happens is, and some theologians call this idea like the impossible possibility. That God said, here's the way to live, do this, but humans are like, we're going to do this instead. And it creates a whole other realm of new possibilities. It's kind of like when you're driving and you're following your GPS. Do you ever not listen to it and turn off early or decide to go your own way? What does it do? It yells at you. It stops for a moment and it has to kind of figure out what in the world is happening here, because here is the route. You're not on the route. And then it has to do redirecting and then come up with a whole new plan. So basically, God set the world, here's the route, and humans were like, I think I know a shortcut. Left-hand turn, and God's like redirecting. And now brand new options are available, and they aren't good options. That's kind of like what Augustine is saying in a not perfect analogy. We were supposed to do this way. And if we had stayed on this route, everything would have been good. But we chose to do our different routes, and now you're going to end up stuck behind construction, or you're going to go into a sinkhole because those things happen around here, and a lot of bad's going to result. So for Augustine, evil comes because we choose that which is not God. Anything which is not God's plan, God's will, God's rules, is the absence of God's there, so that becomes defined as evil. Anything not good with God. So, that makes sense, right? We choose away from God, and thus we have these consequences that follow from all these choices we make. We each have experienced times when we have made a bad choice and we have had to suffer consequences from that bad choice. One of the things I learned early on with early childhood education is you have to talk to children about natural consequences. Instead of just punishment, they don't always understand, oh, you threw the block. We're not going to be able to play in the block area anymore if we throw the block again. Oh, you threw the block again. We're going to have to choose another area to play. It's natural consequences. So evil is kind of a natural consequence. We choose this. Oh no, we don't get to have this delight anymore. We don't get to live in the garden. Oh, you chose to be mean to somebody, now they're mean to you. It's a kind of a natural, we live within all these consequences, not only of ourselves, but of others. Because if one person makes a bad choice, it often affects everybody. It's like when you're in class and 3 people are talking and your entire class loses recess. I always didn't like those kids. I wanted my recess. So, it seems like everything's solved now, right? Wrong. Still, the problem was not actually solved. Because then you have these questions of where did Satan come from, if God created the world good and all this. Now, as I said last week, we often conflate Satan, the devil, the serpent, Lucifer all together, and they aren't really all together as one being in the Bible. But traditional Christianity, especially at the time of Augustine, they kind of smashed them all together in a mashed-up kind of character. Kind of like how Santa Claus has kind of become. All these different cultures had these different ideas, and they all got smashed in together into like one character at this point. So the question is, well, where does that come from? How, if the traditional story is Satan, Lucifer was an angel, a good angel, who rebelled against God and fell to earth and caused rebellion among humans, well, how did that happen? Do angels have free will too? Is there a flaw in their design? Is it a virus? What's happening here? Now, the Bible doesn't give us almost any information about angels. There's traditional ideas. This guy named Dionysius kind of wrote this book about the 9 orders of angels. Goes like seraphim, cherubim, thrones, dominions, powers, wheels. I haven't studied this in like 18 years. Archangels, angels, things like that. And it's just all kind of wild speculation. We don't know much about angels. So there's not really an answer of how did Satan or Lucifer, whoever, decide to go rogue and cause all these problems. So Augustine doesn't have an answer. He's kind of silent, because when people ask, well, how do you account for the original fall? Augustine just kind of is quiet there. So if evil is just a byproduct of human freedom, then what about the serpent in Genesis? Is this a real serpent, or is it a metaphor? Now again, all of that early Genesis is a metaphor written much later. Genesis 1 is actually earlier than Genesis 2. Genesis 2 was written before Genesis 1. But we put Genesis 1 first. There's reasons for all that. Because again, it's different authors write. It gets compiled together in around 500 BCE. But a lot of it's kind of attempts to explain things. So the serpent asks the question, couldn't you do better? What if you did this instead? Now, we all have that voice in us that sometimes makes us question. Well, couldn't we do this and not get caught? Couldn't we take this shortcut? It's okay if you do this, and here's why. We often love to rationalize our actions, don't we? We all have that voice in us that makes us question right and wrong and convince ourselves what we're doing is okay, and here's why. I think the early Israelite people, it wasn't so much about a serpent. It's about, there's that voice that always makes us question. And it's hard to deal with when it's in here. But if we can make it an external thing, we can talk about it. We can deal with it more. But one way or the other, we all have this kind of evil questioner in us that makes us always say, well, you could take this shortcut. You don't have to follow this route. What do they know? We all have that. And the question is, still, why do we all have that? And Augustine never answers that question. Other people have taken it up since Augustine, and we'll talk about those. Now, next week, we're going to talk about Karl Barth, my favorite theologian, and probably yours. You just don't know it yet. So we'll talk about his answer to the question next week. Anybody have questions, comments, snide remarks? That was 15-minute lessons. But I gave a recap, so really, 11 minutes counts. Have a good week.